Hi, everybody. Welcome back. As we saw last time, Pennsylvania Coal versus Mann erased the bright red line between compensable takings in the eminent domain power and non-compensable regulations in the police power, and the takings law, that is, the interpretation of the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment, has been adrift ever since. And what the courts have produced since 1922 all the way down to the present day is a confusing mix of decisions that show very, very little consistency and reach decisions on the basis of a host of differing principles and sometimes reach contradictory results. To cite just two examples of this confusion, consider United States versus Cosby, which was decided by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1946, just after the end of World War II. Cosby owned a farm in North Carolina on which he raised chickens, and the farm was near a military airfield in which heavy American military aircraft landed and took off on a strip of airspace directly over Cosby's farm. So there were B-29 bombers, much like the one in the picture, several times a day, flying over Cosby's farm at an altitude which was low enough, literally, to drive his chickens bonkers. The case describes the problems with the chickens when the planes went over. They became crazy. They jumped up and down. They threw themselves against the side of the chicken coop, and sometimes they badly injured themselves out of fright or whatever in response to the airplanes. So, as a result of the damage to his chickens, Cosby sued the government and said that the flights of the planes over his farm causing damage to his chickens was a compensable taking under the eminent domain power, and he asked the government for compensation. But the Supreme Court decided the case in his favor on a ground that was rather different than the one that Cosby had originally suggested. Citing an ancient doctrine, the Supreme Court ruled that the government had taken what the law calls an easement in Cosby's airspace by eminent domain. It's as if the government had drawn a tube at some altitude above Cosby's farm and flown its airplanes through that tube directly over Cosby's farm. The government, the Supreme Court held, thus had taken the value of the land, indeed had taken the land represented by the tube of airspace through which its planes were flying, and as a result of taking this piece of land, the easement in the air, the United States, said the court, must pay the full value of the easement, which it estimated at $2,000, to compensate for the taking of the easement by the government. Notice that the government is not compensating for the damage to the chickens, which is what really exercised Cosby. It's being charged, as it were, for purchasing a piece of Cosby's airspace, which the government had appropriated to fly its planes over, and, by using the airspace in this way, attacking Cosby's chickens. Fair enough, one might say. It's not a bad result, and there's certainly a way to think about the case in which this is the logical outcome. But it doesn't really resolve the problem that was caused by the airplanes, which was driving the chickens bonkers. What about Cosby's neighbors? Suppose there was another chicken farm adjacent to Cosby's farm, but the airplanes didn't exactly fly over the adjacent farm. Nonetheless, the airplanes made enough noise so that the chickens in the neighbor's farm were injured or damaged in exactly the way that they'd been injured in Cosby's case. But under the court's ruling in Cosby's case, Cosby's neighbors would have no recourse. That is to say, the government has never taken an easement in their land because the planes don't fly over the adjacent farm, and therefore the government is not responsible to pay Cosby's neighbors either for the destruction of the chicken or for the taking of the airspace. Here's a second case, also arising out of facts in World War II, that was decided not long after Cosby by the Supreme Court. It's called United States versus Caltex. Caltex was and is an oil company, and it owned a very valuable oil terminal in Manila Bay, something like the picture of the oil terminal on the slide. But late in 1941, after the Japanese army had attacked the Philippines, General MacArthur ordered his army to retreat in the face of the Japanese, and on the 31st of December 1941, General MacArthur ordered the destruction of Caltex's oil terminal in Manila Bay in order to keep that terminal and the valuable oil refining facilities that were near it away from the enemy. After the war, Caltex sued in order to get the value of its oil terminal in compensation from the government. Caltex didn't challenge the government's power to destroy the oil terminal. It recognized that General MacArthur was in a war, that war sometimes requires that governments take action against the property of citizens, and Caltex did not challenge this power. But the entirety of the oil terminal was destroyed. The value of Caltex's property was reduced just about by 100%. And so Caltex, following Pennsylvania Coal, wants this deemed a compensable taking. It's willing to do its part for the national war effort, but it wants to be compensated for the destruction of its extremely valuable property, almost down to zero. But the Supreme Court denies the claim. Cosby might have been surprised by this, and the Supreme Court argued that it was the government's great need for the property, the exigency of the wartime emergency, and the necessity of General MacArthur's destruction order that relieved the government of the obligation to pay for the property that it had taken. Because the government needed the property so much, the court said, the destruction of private property in battle must be borne by the sufferers alone. This looks like it is quite contradictory to Cosby. In Cosby, the chickens were asked, to sacrifice themselves for the war effort, but Cosby was compensated for their value. He was not asked whether he wanted to lose the chickens. Indeed, the chickens were not asked whether they wanted to be lost. Cosby's easement was taken from him without his consent. He did his part in the war, and now he's going to be compensated for it. Caltex sees itself in exactly the same position, and it argues that the case for compensation is even stronger when the government has such a great need for the property. It's obvious that the government, all the people of the United States, were going to realize a tremendous benefit by keeping the Caltex oil terminal from falling into the hands of the Japanese army. In such a case, wouldn't it make sense to force the government to pay because it has the great need, rather than in fact relieving it from the obligation to pay for the same reason? I suspect, although I don't know, that the real reason behind the Caltex decision was that a contrary decision, a decision that put Caltex in the same place as the Pennsylvania Coal Company and characterized the destruction of the Caltex terminal as a compensable eminent domain taking, that ruling would have had intolerable consequences and implications for other cases that might arise in the future. For example, almost 500,000 American soldiers, sailors, and airmen were killed during World War II. And so the question then becomes, they too gave their all for the war effort, and many of them were conscripted. That is, they did not volunteer to join the army, they were made to join the army by the law. Once they were in the army, they did their bit, and they were killed. Ought they not to have a right to compensation if Caltex has a right to compensation? The logic seems irrefutable. And I suspect that the court saw that logical link when it was deciding Caltex, and by deciding Caltex in the way that it did, it precluded suits by the survivors of those 500,000 dead soldiers to win compensation for their own deaths in an analogous case. The court felt, obviously, I think, that it was just not on to compensate the survivors of the soldiers, and that to lay the groundwork for such a precedent, should it ever be needed, Caltex had to be decided in the way that it was. And so we see cases being decided more or less on an ad hoc basis for at least 60 years after the decision in Pennsylvania Cole versus Mann. The pendulum in the Supreme Court swung back and forth between favoring compensable takings in the spirit of John Locke and favoring non-compensable regulations in the police power in the spirit of Jeremy Bentham. Let me remind you of what Locke and Bentham's respective positions on the takings issue might be. For John Locke, every act of government that takes property must be compensated. That's why we have a government in the first place, according to Locke. Compensation protects individuals and their rights. It makes it impossible for the government to destroy individuals by taking property rights from them and reducing the value of their property substantially. If the government acts in such a way as to create losses in the pursuit of its legitimate purposes, then Locke would argue those who suffer the loss must be compensated. And in doing so, Locke might argue, this makes the government look at the price tag. If the government knows that it's going to have to compensate those whom its acts injure in the eminent domain power, Locke might argue that this would force the government to pay very close attention to looking at the benefits of the act and then looking at the costs of the act to make sure that the benefits are sufficiently large so as to justify the payment of compensation to the individuals who lose as a result of the act. Finally, Locke might say, holding the government to a requirement of compensation whenever its acts cause damage to individuals might limit the field and the scope of government, and for Locke, that generally is an end to be desired. On the other hand, Jeremy Bentham would take a very liberal interpretation of the police power because, in fact, he would argue, as we've seen before, that government has an obligation to pursue the public welfare. In Bentham's characterization, the government has an obligation to pursue policies that maximize the sum of individual utilities. And as it does so, Bentham says, government must have complete or plenary power to pursue the public good. Because the public good is politically superior to the private good, individuals must accept the sacrifice of their losses in order to produce the social benefits that government produces with its acts. By the same token, because public good is superior to private interest, the rights that enable people to obstruct the public good, those very rights that Locke would applaud as limiting the scope and the field of government, rights that enable people to obstruct the public good for Bentham should not be recognized, and government should be free to act without the burden of compensating the losers whenever the social benefits of its act, that is, the sum of the utility increases that its act produces, is greater than the sum of the costs that the act imposes upon other people. As I've said, the pendulum in the American courts and in the law reviews swung back and forth between Locke and Bentham throughout the course of the 20th century, reflecting the larger general tenor of the land, politically speaking. During the middle part of the 20th century, when government was seen with more sympathetic eyes by most of the American people, and Bentham was in the ascendancy, theories of the police power and the takings clause that favored the Benthamite view were common. But somewhat later, when the pendulum had swung the other way and a more Lockean view prevailed, which was less friendly to government and less friendly to government action in the purported public interest, theories emerged that would express Locke's view in articulating the differences between the police power and the eminent domain power. So let me conclude this section of the course by considering two of these theories of the takings clause and the police power, one decidedly Benthamite and the other decidedly Lockean. The Benthamite theory comes from the pen of Frank Michelman, a professor of law at Harvard Law School, who wrote an article in 1968 in which he attempted to offer a general theory of when it is that a government act which has unfavorable consequences for some citizens generates a requirement of compensation to those citizens and when it does not. Michelman noted that every act taken by the government has people who gain benefits as a result of the act and produces people who bear costs and thus lose utility as a result of the act. This, he says, is in the nature of public affairs and in the nature of politics. Very, very, very few measures win unanimous assent. When the majority rules, the minority must suffer costs as a result of the prevalence of the majority. But, Michelman says, every act not only produces benefits and costs from the substance of the act itself, but the decision to pay or not pay compensation for the loser's costs from the benefits of the gainers themselves have effects that go beyond the benefits and the costs of the act itself. And Michelman says that the decision to compensate or not should be made by comparing these extra effects that are different and additional to the benefits and costs of the acts themselves. So Michelman notes that if compensation is paid for a government act that creates losers, and the losers are compensated in full by the government for the losses that they have suffered, in the Lockean sense, this will help guarantee the efficiency of the act by forcing the government to pay close attention to whether the benefits of the act are large enough to justify the compensation that the government is going to have to pay. On the other hand, Michelman argues, if the government does pay compensation, in addition to the value of the costs of the act, which is themselves the level of the compensation, the amount of the compensation that has to be paid, in addition to those costs, paying compensation incurs what Michelman calls settlement costs. The losers have to be identified. The amount of each individual's loss must be identified for certain. And then checks must be cut and sent out to everybody who is lost. And all of these activities, Michelman argues, generate costs, the costs he calls settlement costs, and in some kinds of cases, particularly where the number of losers is very large and where the amount of cost that each has suffered is relatively small, settlement costs may prove to be very, very large. On the other hand, if compensation is not paid and losers are required to simply swallow the losses that the act has produced for them, Michelman argues that demoralization costs will be incurred, and that demoralization costs, the costs that arise from a decision not to compensate the losers for the cost that they've suffered as a result of an act, demoralization costs generate two kinds of effects. One are economic demoralization costs, which Michelman characterizes as lost investment or other kinds of changed economic behaviors that result from people's understanding that they are liable to be treated unjustly at the hands of the government as it has treated someone else in a particular case where the decision not to pay compensation has been made. This harkens back to the Hayek thought example that we developed earlier, which suggested that when in fact there was stealing, economic demoralization might prevent anyone from investing in production in the next period to the detriment of everybody in society. Michelman appeals to the same point by arguing that the failure to pay compensation for lost property values may discourage people in the future from investing in property for fear that their property values will also be taken from them by the government without a requirement of compensation. But even where demoralization has no economic effects, Michelman argues, it might have moral effects, and there might be moral demoralization costs that arise as outrage in individuals over the injustice that the failure to pay compensation to the losers in another case has created for them. This outrage may not manifest itself in any change of behavior, and it may not show up as a change in the price of any good exchanged in markets. But just as the moral costs of crime are real, for Michelman, the moral demoralization costs of the failure to pay compensation are themselves real, and because they're real, they must be taken into account in deciding whether to pay compensation or not in the wake of any given governmental act. And so, Michelman argues that we should pay compensation, that is, call the act in question a taking in the eminent domain power, when the demoralization costs of not paying compensation are greater than the settlement costs of paying compensation. And he says we should not pay compensation, that is, we should call the act in question a non-compensable regulation in the police power, when the settlement costs of paying compensation exceed the demoralization costs of not paying compensation. It's a Benthamite idea, and it's obviously one that could best be done by legislatures. And so, I'll ask you, perhaps as an exercise in your free time, to see whether you could apply Michelman's theory to the facts of the cases that we've just talked about. How would Michelman decide Mugler versus Kansas? How would he decide United States versus Cosby? How might he decide United States versus Caltex? Michelman's theory was published in 1968, and it had some effect on the decisions of the Supreme Court in the years immediately following its publication. In a famous case involving the designation of the Grand Central Terminal, or the Penn Central Terminal, in New York as a national historical monument, the Supreme Court appealed to a utilitarian theory of the Takings Clause, which owed much to Michelman's argument in denying compensation to the owners of that property for the lost value as a result of the designation of their property as a historical landmark. But after the 1970s, the political mood of the country shifted toward the right. The Benthamite view was slowly eclipsed by a more Lockean perspective on the relation of government to individuals, and more particularly on the government's obligation to compensate or not compensate. And almost as if in reply to Michelman's theory, a theory of takings and police power from the Lockean point of view was offered by the University of Chicago law professor Richard Epstein in a 1984 book about the Takings Clause. Epstein is perhaps the most prominent Lockean legal philosopher working today, and his argument is straight out of the Second Treatise of Government. Property rights, Epstein argues, are not held at the sufferance of the government, and the government has no general authority or warrant to take anybody's property rights without paying compensation for them. Moreover, says Epstein, this should not be decided on the basis of some abstract theory that can be applied only by a legislature and has no application, generally speaking, immediately to concrete cases. On the contrary, argues Epstein, the decision to compensate or not compensate in the wake of a government action that harms some individuals should be enforced by a series of 4 clear, direct, general rules, and not decided generally on the case-by-case basis that the courts have been working with over the last decades. The first of these rules asks the question of whether there was a taking at all. Does the act, Epstein asks, interfere with the owner's possession, use, or disposition of the object. And in answering this question, Epstein adopts Ely's theory of conceptual severance. Every interference with an owner's possession, use, or disposition of an object for Epstein is a complete taking of a single arrow representing the property right to that use or possession or disposition, and as the complete taking of a single property right, it is fully compensable by the government. The second question is the taking justified? And if the answer is no, then compensation must be paid. If the taking is justified, according to Epstein, then compensation is not required. So the question of justification of taking for Epstein amounts to a theory of the police power. And his theory of the police power is that it is coextensive with the ancient common law doctrine of nuisance. And Epstein argues that the government acts in the police power when it is acting as the agent of many individual cost bearers, all of whom are suffering a common nuisance or interference with the quiet enjoyment of their own property on the part of another individual. Perhaps the textbook example of a police power regulation for Epstein would be the placement of the initial entitlement to be free from the costs of the smoke that the legislature placed in the steel plant's neighbors in our steel plant example. Each of those steel plant neighbors, Epstein would note, would have at common law an action in nuisance against the steel plant, because they all the neighbors have the same common cause of action in nuisance against the steel plant. Epstein would give the government the right to act against the steel plant by giving the neighbors the right to collect compensation from the steel plant for the costs that they've borne as a result of the taking of their good health. And if the government does so, Epstein argues, it owes nothing to the steel plant for taking, as it were, away from it the right to freely inflict its smoke and crud on the neighbors without compensation. Third, Epstein asks, is the taking for a public purpose, as the Fifth Amendment explicitly requires? That is, for Epstein, are its benefits close to universal, in which case it is for the public purpose, because everybody or almost everybody in the community derives benefits from the action? Or are the benefits concentrated in a smaller group, in which case they're not public because they're not shared by everyone, they're private because they're focused and concentrated on one group that is smaller than the entirety of the community at large. And thus, for Epstein, as for Locke, redistribution is not a sufficient public purpose, and thus the government may not take property from individuals without compensation for the purpose simply of giving that property to other people. Finally, Epstein asks, has the taking been implicitly compensated? And if it has been implicitly compensated, then compensation beyond that will not be required, and the act will be characterized as being a regulation in the police power. For example, taxes are compensated by services provided, and therefore, Epstein argues, people don't have to be compensated for the taxes that they pay. They pay their taxes, the government produces public services which benefit everyone, and those public services provide the benefits for Epstein that compensate for the payment of the taxes, so no further tax compensation is required for taxes. Similarly, murder laws impose on potential murderers and make it impossible for them to murder without paying a penalty. But these too require no compensation to the murderers because, like everybody else, murderers are benefited by the potential security increases that are created for them by the law against murder. Since everybody benefits from the increase in security that is created by a law against murder, then nobody needs to be compensated for whatever burden putting a price on the act of murder is liable to impose upon them. So what we've seen is that through the 20th century, the courts have swung back and forth between an approach to the takings clause that is more in the spirit of Bentham and Frank Michelman, and at other times the pendulum has swung and the courts decide cases more in the spirit of John Locke and Richard Epstein.